Abusia we de krono fita ena NDC aban wonom ede abo na Nana Dankwa Akufo-Addo ene MPP aban krono fita to boase na wo de hwe video yi sema kakra bi na obetemase bomodin ase obe like video yi wadaro ma share de wadwene ye wono so fo wadwen kire bra emboa ne nyina ye nhua de abusuya se wo Ghana ha ena 2019 Ebraya His Excellency Nana Dankwa Akufo-Addo obeya Ghana mampani ni fie mienu achi ena wodi nhwehwe bi eba ya na wo kase wohwe ebibiman mu a emre bi a atwam be se emfi ahanan ne akire ni yakwase buroni de befa e domum ode ye nkoa ede ye kwotena ne man so ma ye kwosome koye adwumaden ewi akire mpo no sa besesa ye gudie ne enema bi a enka nei nka beso mbodi ama ye ede ko ne man mu nti ebradu se yeko na yekogi ye niema wonom de bere ye nyina afi nsusu no krampo danchene a niema nipa ombefa ye nko befa ye domum no nke be yi a enka wonom entua yeka anase brofika se fense compensation wonom enhye ya na mu firi se wonom ha abibiman papa eno nti nanado ye se edi kan kura no esese wodi kan ede hye abibifo a ewo abmanone no odi kan de hye wonom adwenem se mufiri abibimam enti munkai munchi na monsane mrafie eno nti 2019 na Nanado Dankwa Akufo-Addo wo lanche bibi efa ne se the year of return 2019 ena Nanado ode the year of return wode eba Ghana na olanchi ye no eko amonone nyina kokopa hontuma ma Ghana fo ya wonum ewa amonone esuom dendenden etopete ama abibifo nyina abibifo ewowi Black American ne hwanfo no nyina besuom twetwe se sansem wa Nanado Dankwa Akufo-Addo dia baide eye papa nti wonum hyase se wonum eba wonchi kakra wo mu a broni bi se mehwe mewede a mefiri Ghana no mabesra Ghana we se mehwe a mefiri Nigeria we se matese yese minchi ewo Zimbabwe we se me mefiri Kenya wonum nyina sa the year of return no eno ne step 1 Nana Dankwa Akufo-Addo di kan pa hontoma wode ebae na de tosu mienu so ena wasanya akwan ewo UN mekire United Nations General Assembly wasade kotudwa se ebradu se akwasi buroni kokko ya obefa ye domum no wohwe na wotua ye soka na eniema bi oba befa ye esese nko de braye bia no wasade ya de ede braye emre bi mpo etwamu anche ena asantime wura ye moni dinwie nana wadaroma ye mbodi wie bodi kasem otumfo se tutu ababio eba bede dwa se Britain anase British se wonum so ebra omoni asantima enya wokon kase no wonum be fa de your friend say the golden stew asese dwa anase sika dwa kokko no wonum ebe fa ede koi eno nti ene wonum ahunu se eniema wonum be ye bibifo ne eniema bi a ekoso wo man Ghana mu ene ebibimam no entwa yie eno nti bibia wonum be fa ye bia no wosa ho no mo no won be san ede wonum ade ede abre wom edidididi mu a ena saa dwumadie ni nyina ekoso ebie na Nanado Dankwa Akufo-Addo edi kan po yenkonkutie ne nsem a wode tu dwa ewo UN General Assembly efa repatriation anase akwasi buroni esese wohwe na eka bi a waboye bia no oba betua yeka no ye ne kan tie Nanado ne tie Nanado wie a na yaka akohwe de bese na wotwe etwa mu no His Excellency John Dramani Mahama wono so kwatena UN General Assembly a wode kokotu dwa a o hye se ebre du se ye kai abibiman ye befa ye koye ene ade nyina no kwasi buroni hwe na wontwa ye soka firi se wo haye ye ni kan entie His Excellency Nanado Dankwa Akufo-Addo
changing, and it is time to bring the subject of reparations firmly to the fore. Granted, the current generations are not the ones that engage in the slave trade, but that grand inhuman enterprise was state-sponsored and deliberate, and its benefits are clearly interwoven with the present-day economic architecture of the nations that designed and executed it. Reparations must be paid for the slave trade. No amount of money will ever make up for the horrors, but it would make the point that evil was perpetrated, that millions of productive Africans were snatched from the embrace of our continent and put to work in the Americas and the Caribbean without compensation for their labor. If there are any hesitations in some minds about the paying of reparations, it is worth considering the fact that when slavery was abolished, the slave owners were compensated for the loss of the slaves because the human beings were labeled as property, deemed to be commodities. Surely, this is a matter that the world must confront and can no longer ignore. The African Union has authorized Ghana to hold a global conference on the issue in November in Accra. It is probably also the time to return to that vexed subject of illicit financial outflows out of the continent of Africa. I refer to the report of the panel chaired by the highly respected former South African President Thabo Mbeki on the illicit flow of funds from Africa, which states that Africa is losing annually more than 88 billion United States dollars through illicit financial outflows. Yes, those monies too must be returned to the continent. It is difficult to understand why the recipient countries are comfortable about retaining such funds and are happy to call those countries from whom the monies are taken as corrupt. I believe that a joint task force of the African Union Commission and the OECD Secretariat under the auspices of the United Nations should be charged to find ways of stopping the damaging outflow.
Piao otrofo na se medansi no abrochimem His Excellency Nana Dankwa Akufo-Addo nsemu a wode to akwasi buroni anim e wo saa niam we ho 2018 2019 2020 mu ho we ni nsemu a Nana Addo o hyase a wo bo ho de wura the year of return na ene His Excellency John Dramani Mahama sunya akwan kokopie mu wo hono mo no yenkunkuti nsemu a wono so ede to wo manim ene wiase nyina ebo yensem hia ede man se watimi asole agina brane ahye se ebibiman yakwasi buroni befa edomum befa yenkoa wode yakọ ne maso kokọ ha yen wama ene yakachi wa brabom nti wonom hwe na wonom entua yesoka yenkoti His Excellency John Dramani Mahama Somra.
This resolution allows us as a global community to collectively bear witness to the plight of about more than 12.5 million men, women, and children whose homes, communities, names, families, hopes, dreams, futures, and lives were stolen from them over the course of 400 years. I speak these words today not only for Ghana, but also in solidarity with the rest of Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the wider diaspora, and indeed all people of good conscience throughout the world. This resolution is a pathway to healing and reparative justice. This resolution is a safeguard against forgetting. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, violence begins with language. When words are weaponized or to codify abuse, when people are called out of their names, regardless of their state of dress, when slaves were captured, they were always stripped of their clothing while being kept in the dungeons of the fortresses that had been built on the African coast by the European traders. They were forced with their limbs chained and shackled into the hold of cargo ships. They remained naked, packed like sardines during the month-long journey through the Middle Passage. Not all those who were loaded onto the ships survived the voyage. A number of the ships sank with their entire human cargo. Others who fell sick were thrown overboard. And a few who preferred death to captivity voluntarily jumped overboard. It is believed that 10 to 20% of enslaved people died in the Middle Passage. Whenever a ship arrived at its destination, the enslaved people, still naked, to the market where they were inspected and appraised like livestock. They were then placed on an auction block in front of an audience of potential buyers and sold to the highest bidder. Once they arrived on the plantation where they would work and live for a lifetime, they were also stripped of their names. And so you were no longer Fatu or Kofi or Bubakar or Nanayao or Menka, Nayong or Hamisu. You were given names like Ben, Jemima, John, Toby, or Mary. In addition to these new names, they were also called girl or boy, regardless of how old you were. And maybe I should also say that filthy N-word. If you ever needed a surname, it would be that of your master. And sometimes they were branded like cattle with the plantation's insignia or logo. There were sugar plantations. There were also coffee, cotton, tobacco, and cocoa plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. South America had diamond and gold mines as well. And also the production of indigo took place in Jamaica. The people who were enslaved labored on those plantations from sunrise to sunset. And the conditions under which they worked were brutal. They were beaten occasionally to the point of death. They were underfed. They were kept in cramped quarters and often died young, if not from labor, then from disease. There are even records of some enslaved women who were kept as breeders. Let's not mince words, ladies and gentlemen. Business was booming because when labor is free, profit margins are huge. African lives were disposable. If too many of the enslaved Africans died, more were captured from their homes on the continent, enslaved and trafficked. During conversations about slavery, the point at which euphemisms are introduced, there's the point at which you've used, and there's a rush to talk about abolition. But we cannot afford to look away. This is precisely the part when we should pay close attention, because the devil is in the detail. And I'm going to share 4 trafficking destinations with you. Remember, when you hear these numbers, that it's not about data. These are about human beings and human lives. Roughly 6 million enslaved Africans were trafficked to Brazil, which is the 5th largest nation in the world, stretching 4,400 kilometers from north to south and 4,320 kilometers from east to west. Almost 2 million enslaved Africans were trafficked to Jamaica, which was the most profitable of all sugar-producing locations. Jamaica is 235 kilometers long and between 34 and 84 kilometers wide, depending on which point you are located. About 500,000 enslaved Africans were trafficked to America from the early 17th century, when the first ship arrived, to the 19th century, when chattel slavery was eventually abolished. America grew from 3 colonies to an independent nation with 36 states. Over 450,000 enslaved Africans were trafficked to Barbados, an island that is 34 kilometers wide and 34 kilometers long and 23 kilometers wide. Before the trafficking of enslaved Africans, plantation labor in Barbados came from white indentured servants who were usually Irish. There were 2 major problems with it. One was that they eventually had to be granted their freedom. And the other was that if they ran away, catching them proved challenging because they blended in, they were white. In 1661, Barbados enacted a code for the enslaved. And in the preamble, it said, Negroes are described as, and I quote, a heathenish, brutish, and uncertain, dangerous kind of people, quotations closed. It goes on to explain that this is why there must be a set of laws detailing how they should be punished. Clause 2 of the same code details what to do if any Negro man or woman shall offer any violence to any Christian, as by striking or the like. And it goes on to say that if it is a first offense, the Negro should be severely whipped by the constable. If it is the Negro's second offense, he shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in the face. The code gave owners and overseers the ability to torture, maim, and even kill enslaved Africans with impunity. And became something of a template for the rest of the Anglo-Atlantic world. In 1662, a year after Barbados enacted this code, a legal doctrine was established to set judicial precedent in the American colony of Virginia. It was titled Partus Sequitur Ventrum, for those of you who understand Latin, which what is born follows the womb. This legal framework ensured that all children born of enslaved women would also automatically be enslaved regardless of who the father was. And it is important to note that many enslaved were impregnated because they were raped by the plantation owners or their overseers. But what this law did, even in case the baby was not the product of rape, was to strip the child of its paternity in the eyes of the law. That child, as an enslaved person, was property that could be given or sold at its owner's whim. The Americans, including in Brazil. People sometimes try to put a disclaimer on slavery by insisting that you cannot use the social norms of today to judge the actions and events that took place in the past. Well, such people are loud and wrong.